We really need to talk about David McBride. Because this news about one of the most notorious yet tragically misunderstood whistleblowers in Australian history is wild. Because on the surface, this story looks like one thing, but by the end of it, you'll see that it's something so much more complicated. So let's start at the beginning, 2011. That's when McBride, an Oxford Law graduate and an ex-British Army captain, began work as a legal officer for the Australian Defence Force, or ADF. And during his first tour in Afghanistan that year, he says he first began to have doubts about the mission there, with him observing how military leaders kept telling the public that they were winning the war when he could see with his own eyes that just wasn't true. Meanwhile, rumors floated around about soldiers murdering innocent people, and then, during his second tour 2 years later, everything changed for McBride.
I saw things that really made me become a whistleblower in 2013 on my Special Forces tour. We were suddenly investigating people who are just defending themselves, and we were trying to put them in jail, and we are suddenly running around trying to find scapegoats. We had become incredibly cynical, where we would make heroes when they weren't heroes. We would make villains when they weren't villains. We didn't care about whether we were actually winning the war. We put out false messages. The Afghan people meant nothing to us. It was all a political pantomime, an ad.
And so he returned home, and for the next few years, he mulled over what he had seen, sinking into a dark place. Drinking liquor every day, abusing ADHD medication, suffering from undiagnosed PTSD. But then slowly, he came to the conviction that he needed to blow the whistle, which as it turns out, is a bit of a family tradition. See, David's father, the obstetrician Dr. William McBride, he blew the whistle on birth defects caused by a pregnancy drug in the 1960s.
Concern over the tragic effects of the new sedative thalidomide prompts President Kennedy at his press conference to call for stronger, better administered drug laws.
So working late in the night at an army base near Canberra, the younger McBride began copying hundreds of classified documents, smuggling them home in a backpack batch by batch over the course of 18 months. And at first, he tried the official channels, with him filing an internal complaint and then going to the police and then the defense minister, but neither worked. So in 2017, McBride took his stash of papers to the press, specifically to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, or the ABC. And he pitched them a story of army leadership so worried about the perception of war crimes that they went after honest soldiers. But when the reporter Dan Oakes reviewed the evidence, he saw a different story, with him later telling the ABC's Four Corners program that not only did he find actual war crimes, but the army tried to cover them up.
The more I looked into it, I couldn't conceive of how anyone would claim that these guys were being too tightly monitored. It was precisely the opposite. I mean, the picture that became clear was just one of Afghanistan being a black hole in which events occurred. What happened out in the field stayed out in the field.
So using those documents, the ABC published a series of reports known as the Afghan files, which did include some cases where soldiers genuinely seemed like they may have acted in self-defense or made reasonable mistakes. But there were also cases that looked murky at best and downright inexcusable at worst. Like when special forces guys allegedly shot a man and his 6-year-old son while they were sleeping together under a blanket. Or when others allegedly shot and killed a teenage boy who was collecting figs in the early morning and then they just left his body there without reporting it to any authorities. And all of this went on and on, with a document from 2014 describing a warrior culture within special forces. And that would actually be later corroborated years later by a federal inquiry known as the Brereton Report, which found credible evidence that Australian special forces unlawfully killed 39 civilians and prisoners between 2009 and 2013, with General Angus Campbell explaining at the time,
"This shameful record includes alleged instances in which new patrol members were coerced to shoot a prisoner in order to achieve that soldier's first kill, in an appalling practice known as blooding. Further to this, throwdown weapons and radios were also reportedly planted to support claims that people killed were enemy killed in action."
But while the government apologized for all those killings and the misconduct, it was also busy going after McBride. Because it didn't take police long to figure out it was him behind the leak. But when they ended up swarming his apartment, they found plastic tubs full of classified documents, but no McBride. And that's because he actually fled to Spain, where he hid for about a year. But being the family man that he was, he couldn't help but risk getting caught by returning to Australia for a father-daughter school dance, with that actually being how he was ultimately discovered and interrogated, with him confessing to everything. And so with that, federal police charged him with stealing Commonwealth property, breaching the Defense Act, and disclosing confidential information. But they also didn't stop there. No, they also began building a case against the reporter Dan Oakes, his colleague on the Afghan files Sam Clark, and the ABC News director Gavin Morris, with all three men's names being listed on a search warrant for the ABC's Sydney headquarters. And in 2019, police actually raided the building, seizing documents and shocking the whole world, with media outlets, activist groups, and politicians alike condemning the move as a threat to press freedom. And this is the police never actually found the classified materials there. And facing intense public pressure, prosecutors eventually decided to not charge the journalists, saying that although a case against them them could have been made, doing so would have not been in the public interest. But their case against McBride, they said that was an altogether different story. But with prosecutors arguing that the way that he gathered, stored, and then leaked the documents, that endangered Australia's national security and foreign policy. And so at first, McBride appealed to the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus to drop the charges, which is what the AG did in 2022 for another whistleblower. Right, Bernard Cleary, he exposed how in 2004, Australia allegedly bugged the government offices of East Timor to gain the upper hand in negotiations over lucrative oil and gas reserves. But this time, Dreyfus wouldn't budge, so McBride, he rolled up his sleeves for a fight in court, with his lawyers arguing that he acted with honorable intentions and out of a sense of personal duty. And in pretrial hearings, the central debate was over the meaning of that one word, duty. Because the prosecution claimed that a soldier's duty is to simply follow orders. But the defense countered that it entails something higher, serving and protecting Australia, even if that means breaking the rules. But in the end, we saw the judge side with the prosecution. Putting the final nail in the coffin, he granted their request to bar McBride's defense from using certain crucial evidence because they said it was too sensitive. And so with that, McBride's lawyers broke it to him that he had no choice but to plead guilty, which he ended up doing last year. But as he explained, that wasn't the worst outcome.
That kind of sacrifice, getting sentenced to prison, has been a possible aim for me because it brings into stark relief the idea of someone standing up for what they believe is right for Australian values. I felt like a winner when I came out of the court on that Friday after entering the guilty pleas. For some reason, I felt that we had put a fatal blow to the security state in that they'd had to commit themselves to unquestionable following of orders in order to beat me.
And all of that, it brings the story full circle because his father, William McBride, also fell from his whistleblowing heights. Right, that after he was found guilty of falsifying research on other pregnancy drugs and forced to stop practicing medicine. So that's not to say that David's goodbye wasn't also sad.
I was trying to spend the last weekend with my daughter. So I'll make it short. I just want to thank everybody that supported me over the past 5 years, 6 years. As I say, I may have broken the law, but I did not break my oath to the Australian people.
And so now, at the age of 60, he's been sentenced to 5 years and 8 months in jail with the possibility of parole after 27 months. And as the judge left the bench, some in the public gallery reportedly shouted, "Shame on you," at him. All while McBride was left hugging his friends and family for the final time before he was let off into custody. And so now we're seeing advocates amplifying complaints that they've long made Australia's whistleblower protections too weak, pointing out that they make whistleblowers meet onerous requirements before disclosing information, which ironically makes it easier for the authorities to catch them. And what's more is that the government's already put McBride in jail, but none of the alleged war criminals that he exposed have been convicted, and only one's even been charged. But then again, that also gets to a deeper, even messier contradiction at the heart of McBride's story. Because the media, the public, politicians, activists, even his own lawyers lifted him up as a martyr who was persecuted for speaking up about war crimes. But to turn him into that, a martyr, a hero, a symbol, they had to paper over the real flesh and blood David McBride, a man whose goals were much different than those of many of his supporters. Because remember, he wasn't just trying to expose some war crimes. So to McBride, the war crimes were just a symptom of rotten leadership at the highest levels of the military. And by overzealously investigating them, the generals washed their hands of any blame. So they could go on waging a war that had less to do with actually winning and more to do with saving face, which is exactly what the Washington Post Afghanistan papers confirmed about the American side of all this in 2019, revealing that for 2 decades, while the war in Afghanistan bumbled along disastrously with no end in sight, the U.S. government and military covered up the truth and presented a rosy picture to the public they knew was a lie. Yet the ABC put out a documentary just weeks before McBride's sentencing claiming he only wanted to defend alleged war criminals.
He never at any point, I believe, mentioned war crimes or showed any desire to uncover war crimes or have people punished for war crimes.
Which is why McBride has since accused Dan Oakes of essentially working for the government. And so if we can't deliver David McBride actual justice by setting him free, at least we can do him the justice of remembering the bigger picture that he's been trying to show us from the start.